There is one sentence Jesus said that millions of people quote every single day. It appears in conversations, debates, social media posts, and even arguments about morality. You've probably heard it before. In fact, you may have said it yourself. Sometimes people say it to stop a disagreement. Sometimes they say it when someone points out something wrong. And sometimes they say it as if those words end the entire discussion. The sentence is simple. Just 3 words. Do not judge. Or in another translation, judge not. It is one of the most famous statements Jesus ever made. And yet, it may also be one of the most misunderstood. Because today, this sentence is often used to mean something very different from what Jesus actually meant. In modern culture, don't judge has almost become a universal rule. It is often used to say, no one should ever tell anyone else they are wrong. No one should question someone else's choices. No one should make moral distinctions. Everyone should simply accept everything. And if someone disagrees, if someone points out something harmful, if someone challenges a decision, the response often comes quickly. Don't judge. But here's the question that rarely gets asked. Is that really what Jesus meant? Did Jesus truly teach that people should never recognize wrongdoing? Did he teach that truth and error should never be distinguished? Did he say that no one should ever correct anyone else? Because when you actually look at the life and teachings of Jesus, something interesting begins to appear. Jesus often spoke very clearly about right and wrong. He challenged hypocrisy. He confronted corruption. He warned people about false teachers. He even directly corrected the behavior of those around him. There were moments when his words were gentle, moments when he showed extraordinary compassion, moments when he forgave people who were burdened with shame. But there were also moments when his words were strong, moments when he spoke uncomfortable truth, moments when people walked away because what he said challenged them deeply. So this creates a tension. On one hand, Jesus said, do not judge. But on the other hand, he clearly did not avoid speaking truth about human behavior, which means something important must be happening beneath the surface of that command. Something deeper than the simple way it is often quoted today. The reality is that Jesus was not giving people permission to ignore truth. He was not teaching moral indifference. And he was certainly not encouraging a world where no one ever confronts wrongdoing. Instead, he was addressing something far more dangerous. Something that has existed throughout human history. Something that can quietly grow even within religious communities. He was confronting the problem of hypocritical judgment. The kind of judgment that focuses on the faults of others while ignoring the condition of one's own heart. The kind of judgment that condemns instead of helping. The kind of judgment that elevates oneself by tearing others down. In other words, Jesus was not condemning discernment. He was confronting arrogance. But over time, the meaning of his words has slowly shifted in popular culture. Today, many people use do not judge as a shield that protects them from criticism, a shield that prevents difficult conversations, a shield that allows behavior to go unquestioned. And while that might create temporary comfort, it also creates confusion. Because without the ability to recognize right and wrong, wisdom becomes impossible. Imagine a doctor who refuses to diagnose illness because they do not want to judge the patient. Imagine a teacher who refuses to correct mistakes because they do not want to make students uncomfortable. Imagine a judge in a courtroom who refuses to evaluate evidence because they believe evaluating behavior is wrong. In every one of those situations, the absence of discernment would create chaos. And the same principle applies to spiritual life. Discernment is not cruelty. Recognizing harmful patterns is not hatred. And speaking truth with humility is not the same as condemning someone. Yet many people today have begun to treat those things as if they were identical. This misunderstanding has quietly reshaped the way people talk about morality, accountability, and even faith. But when we return to the original context of Jesus' words, something remarkable happens. The meaning becomes clearer, stronger, more balanced. Because the command Jesus gave was never meant to silence truth. It was meant to purify the heart of the one speaking it. And when that difference becomes clear, it changes the way we see one of the most famous teachings in the Bible. In fact, it may change the way we see our own hearts as well. Because the real question Jesus was asking was not simply whether we judge others. The real question was something deeper. Before you point out the fault in someone else, have you looked honestly at your own? There are certain phrases in history that become so famous that people repeat them without ever thinking deeply about what they actually mean. They become part of everyday language. They show up in conversations, headlines, social media posts, and debates. Over time, those phrases begin to take on new meanings. Sometimes those meanings drift far away from the original intention. One of the clearest examples of this is the command Jesus gave when he said, "Do not judge." Even people who have never opened a Bible know that phrase. It is quoted by believers and non-believers alike. You might hear it in a discussion about morality. You might see it in a comment section online. You might even hear it during disagreements between friends or family members. Someone points out something that seems wrong, harmful, or dishonest. And almost immediately the response comes, "Don't judge." It is often spoken as if those words end the conversation. As if once that phrase is spoken, no one has the right to question anything anymore. In many ways, "don't judge" has become one of the most powerful social rules of modern culture. But what makes this so interesting is that the phrase itself comes directly from the teachings of Jesus. In the Sermon on the Mount, one of his most well-known messages, Jesus said, "Judge not, that you be not judged." For many people, those words seem straightforward. They appear to mean that judging others is always wrong. And because Jesus spoke them, people assume that the instruction must apply to every situation. But something curious happens when you begin looking at the rest of Jesus' teachings. Because if Jesus truly meant that people should never evaluate the behavior of others, many of his other statements would suddenly make no sense. For example, Jesus warned his followers to be careful of false prophets. He said they would come disguised as harmless and trustworthy, but their actions would reveal their true nature. Then he said something important. You will recognize them by their fruits. In other words, people were expected to observe behavior, examine character, and draw conclusions. That process requires discernment. It requires evaluation. It requires the ability to distinguish truth from deception. In another moment, Jesus confronted religious leaders who were exploiting people while pretending to be righteous. He openly challenged their hypocrisy. He did not pretend that their behavior was harmless. He spoke directly about what was wrong. So if Jesus warned about false teachers and challenged hypocrisy, then clearly he was not teaching that people should never recognize wrongdoing. Instead, something deeper must be happening in his command not to judge. The problem is that over time, culture tends to simplify complex ideas. Nuance disappears. Context fades away. And eventually a short phrase becomes detached from the situation in which it was originally spoken. That is exactly what has happened with this command. Today, "don't judge" is often used as a universal rule that shuts down difficult conversations. It can be used to protect people from criticism. It can be used to avoid accountability. And sometimes it can even be used to justify harmful behavior. But that was never the purpose of Jesus' words. To understand what he meant, we have to step back and consider something important about human nature. People often feel uncomfortable when their actions are questioned. No one enjoys being told they might be wrong. No one enjoys facing the possibility that a decision they made could harm themselves or others. Because of that discomfort, people naturally look for ways to protect themselves from criticism. And one of the easiest ways to do that is to dismiss the person raising the concern. If someone points out a problem, it is much easier to say "don't judge" than it is to carefully consider whether the concern might be valid. But this reaction creates a serious problem. Because when all forms of evaluation are treated as judgment, society loses an important tool: the ability to recognize truth. Think about how often people must make careful evaluations in everyday life. A parent must recognize when a child's behavior needs correction. A teacher must identify mistakes in order to help students learn. A doctor must diagnose illness in order to treat it. A friend must sometimes speak honestly when they see someone making a harmful decision. None of these situations are acts of cruelty. They are acts of care. They are motivated by the desire to help someone grow, heal, or avoid danger. Yet when the phrase "don't judge" is misunderstood, even those necessary conversations can begin to feel wrong. People become afraid to speak truth. They worry that honesty will be interpreted as condemnation. So instead of addressing problems, they remain silent. Instead of offering guidance, they withdraw. Instead of helping others grow, they simply watch from a distance. Ironically, this silence can sometimes cause far more harm than the difficult conversation would have caused. Because ignoring problems does not make them disappear. It only allows them to grow. Imagine a close friend who notices that someone they care about is making choices that are slowly damaging their life. Perhaps those choices involve destructive habits. Perhaps they involve dishonesty. Perhaps they involve relationships that lead to pain. If the friend truly cares, they will eventually face a difficult decision. Do they remain silent in order to avoid appearing judgmental? Or do they speak honestly, even if the conversation feels uncomfortable? Most people instinctively know that true friendship requires honesty. Real love does not ignore harm. Real love wants the other person to flourish. And sometimes flourishing requires correction. This is exactly the kind of tension Jesus was addressing. He was speaking to people who lived in a culture where religious leaders often judged others harshly while ignoring their own failures. These leaders focused intensely on the smallest faults in other people while refusing to examine the deeper problems within their own hearts. Their judgment was not about helping people grow. It was about protecting their own sense of superiority. And that kind of judgment is incredibly destructive. It damages relationships. It produces shame instead of healing. It replaces compassion with pride. So when Jesus spoke the command, "Do not judge," he was confronting that mindset. He was warning against the kind of judgment that condemns others while refusing to look inward. He was challenging people to examine themselves before they attempted to correct anyone else. In other words, he was not eliminating discernment. He was purifying it. The goal was not to remove truth. The goal was to remove hypocrisy. But once that context was forgotten, the command began to take on a very different meaning. Instead of encouraging humility, it became a tool for avoiding accountability. Instead of inspiring self-reflection, it sometimes became a way to silence honest concern. And that is why this command remains one of the most quoted and most misunderstood teachings of Jesus. Because when people repeat those words without understanding their deeper meaning, they unintentionally erase the very wisdom Jesus was trying to teach. The truth is that Jesus never asked people to abandon discernment. He never asked them to pretend that harmful actions were harmless. He never asked them to ignore truth in the name of kindness. What he asked for was something far more challenging. He asked people to confront the pride within their own hearts before they confronted the faults of others. And that difference changes everything, because it transforms judgment from an act of condemnation into an act of humility. It shifts the focus from proving others wrong to seeking genuine growth. And when that shift happens, the words of Jesus begin to reveal their real power. But to understand that power fully, we must first look closely at how this command has been misunderstood in modern culture. Because the misunderstanding itself has created a problem that reaches far beyond theology. It has shaped the way people think about truth, responsibility, and the courage required to speak honestly. And that is where the story continues. If you listen carefully to conversations in modern culture, you will begin to notice something interesting. Whenever a moral disagreement appears, a familiar phrase often emerges. Don't judge. It is spoken quickly, sometimes defensively, sometimes with frustration, but almost always with the assumption that it settles the matter. In many situations, the phrase functions like a barrier. Once it is spoken, the conversation stops. Questions disappear. Accountability fades. And the person who raised the concern is suddenly treated as if they have done something wrong. This reaction has become so common that many people no longer pause to examine what is really happening in that moment. Because beneath the surface, the phrase "don't judge" is often being used in a very specific way. It is not simply expressing humility. It is creating protection. Protection from criticism. Protection from evaluation. Protection from the uncomfortable possibility that someone's actions might need to change. In other words, the phrase is often used as a shield. But here is where the misunderstanding begins. When Jesus said, "Do not judge," he was not giving people a shield against truth. He was giving them a mirror meant to reflect their own hearts. Yet in modern culture, the command has gradually been transformed into something entirely different. Instead of encouraging self-examination, it is often used to silence others. Instead of promoting humility, it can sometimes promote avoidance. Instead of helping people grow, it can unintentionally allow harmful patterns to continue unchallenged. This shift did not happen overnight. It developed slowly as cultural ideas about morality began to change. In earlier generations, moral discussions often centered around shared beliefs about right and wrong. People might disagree about details, but there was generally an understanding that certain actions had real consequences and moral weight. But in many modern societies, a new idea has grown increasingly popular. The idea that truth is entirely personal. The belief that every individual should define right and wrong for themselves. In this environment, the concept of moral accountability becomes uncomfortable. Because if truth is completely subjective, then any attempt to identify harmful behavior may feel like an attack on personal freedom. And this is where the phrase, "don't judge," begins to take on a new role. It becomes a way to defend personal choices from outside evaluation. But there is a logical problem with this approach. A problem that becomes obvious once you look closely. Because the moment someone says, "you shouldn't judge," they are actually making a judgment themselves. They are judging the person who raised the concern. They are declaring that the act of evaluating behavior is wrong. So ironically, the phrase that is meant to eliminate judgment often becomes a form of judgment itself. This contradiction reveals something important. Human beings cannot live without making evaluations. Every day we distinguish between helpful and harmful actions. Every day we decide whether something is wise or foolish. Every day we determine whether a situation is safe or dangerous. These decisions require discernment. Without discernment, life would become chaotic. Imagine a world where people refuse to evaluate behavior at all. A teacher would never correct a student's mistake. A doctor would never diagnose an illness. A parent would never guide a child's choices. A community would never address harmful actions. In such a world, confusion would quickly replace wisdom. Yet when the command of Jesus is misunderstood, it can sometimes create pressure to behave exactly this way. People begin to believe that identifying wrongdoing automatically makes them unloving. They begin to fear that speaking truth will make them appear arrogant. So instead of addressing real problems, they remain silent. And silence, while it may feel peaceful for a moment, rarely produces genuine growth. Because growth requires honesty. Growth requires the courage to confront difficult realities. Consider the role of a close friend. A true friend cares about your well-being. They celebrate your victories. They encourage you during struggles. But they also notice when something is wrong. If a friend sees you making decisions that are slowly damaging your life, real friendship does not ignore that reality. Real friendship speaks, not with cruelty, not with pride, but with honesty and concern. Yet in today's culture, even that kind of loving honesty can sometimes be misunderstood. A friend who expresses concern may be told they are being judgmental. A family member who raises a difficult issue may be accused of being harsh. And because these reactions are uncomfortable, many people learn to avoid difficult conversations altogether. They tell themselves that silence is kindness. But silence is not always kindness. Sometimes silence allows pain to grow unnoticed. Sometimes silence allows destructive patterns to continue. Sometimes silence abandons the very people we claim to care about. The truth is that love and truth were never meant to compete with one another. They were meant to work together. Truth without love becomes harsh and destructive. But love without truth becomes shallow and powerless. When Jesus spoke about judgment, he was addressing a very specific kind of problem. The problem of self-righteous condemnation. The kind of judgment that places oneself above others. The kind that delights in exposing faults rather than helping people overcome them. But modern culture often treats all forms of moral evaluation as if they were the same thing. Discernment becomes confused with condemnation. Concern becomes confused with criticism. And accountability becomes confused with hostility. Once those distinctions disappear, people lose an important part of moral wisdom. Because without the ability to recognize harmful patterns, individuals and communities become vulnerable to deception. This is exactly why Jesus repeatedly warned his followers to remain watchful. He warned them about false teachers who would appear convincing on the surface. He warned them about hypocrisy that hides beneath religious language. He warned them about behaviors that slowly corrupt the heart. Recognizing these dangers requires discernment. And discernment requires evaluation. It requires the willingness to look honestly at actions and ask difficult questions. Are these actions producing good fruit? Do they lead toward truth? Do they reflect genuine integrity? Those questions are not acts of cruelty. They are acts of wisdom. But when the command "do not judge" is misunderstood, even those necessary questions can feel forbidden. And that misunderstanding creates a world where truth becomes harder to recognize. A world where accountability becomes rare. A world where people feel isolated because no one is willing to speak honestly anymore. Ironically, this environment often produces the very thing people were trying to avoid. More pain, more confusion, more broken relationships. Because when truth disappears, trust eventually disappears with it. And without trust, communities cannot flourish. The good news is that the teachings of Jesus were never meant to produce that kind of confusion. His words were never intended to eliminate moral clarity. They were intended to transform the heart of the person speaking. Instead of approaching others with arrogance, he called people to approach them with humility. Instead of condemning others quickly, he called people to examine themselves first. Instead of using truth as a weapon, he called people to use it as a path toward healing. This balance is what modern conversations often miss. The balance between humility and honesty, between compassion and courage, between truth and grace. And when that balance disappears, even the most powerful teachings can become misunderstood. But once we begin to rediscover the original context of Jesus' words, everything starts to make sense again. Because the command, "Do not judge," was never meant to eliminate discernment. It was meant to transform the way discernment is used. And to see that clearly, we must go back to the moment when Jesus first spoke those words. We must return to the setting where this famous command was given, because the context reveals something that changes everything. To truly understand what Jesus meant when he said, "Do not judge," we have to return to the moment those words were spoken. Because words always live inside a context. Without context, even the most profound message can easily be misunderstood. Jesus spoke these words during one of the most well-known teachings in the entire Bible, a message often called the Sermon on the Mount. It was not a private conversation. It was a public teaching delivered to a large crowd. People from many walks of life had gathered to listen. Some were curious. Some were searching for hope. Some were skeptical. And among them were religious leaders who believed they already understood everything about righteousness. The Sermon on the Mount was not simply a list of rules. It was a radical description of what life looks like when the heart is transformed. Jesus spoke about humility. He spoke about mercy. He spoke about forgiveness, generosity, sincerity, and the hidden motives of the human heart. Again and again, he challenged the kind of religion that focused only on external behavior while ignoring inner character. This is the environment where the famous words appear. "Judge not, that you be not judged." But the most important part of this teaching is what comes immediately after. Because Jesus did not stop with that sentence. Instead, he continued with a vivid image. An image so striking that people listening that day likely laughed in surprise when they heard it. He said, "Why do you look at the speck in your brother's eye, but do not notice the plank in your own eye?" Then he continued, "How can you say to your brother, 'Let me remove the speck from your eye,' when there is a plank in your own eye?" It is almost a humorous picture. Imagine someone trying to perform delicate eye surgery on another person while a large wooden beam is sticking out of their own face. The absurdity is obvious. That is exactly the point Jesus was making. He was exposing the ridiculousness of hypocritical judgment. The kind of judgment that magnifies the small faults of others while ignoring much larger problems within oneself. This type of judgment is not motivated by love. It is motivated by pride. It allows people to feel morally superior. It shifts attention away from their own weaknesses, and it replaces humility with self-righteousness. Jesus called this behavior what it truly was. Hypocrisy. He said plainly, "You hypocrite." But notice something extremely important about the rest of the statement. After pointing out the plank in one's own eye, Jesus did not say, "Ignore your brother's speck forever." Instead, he said something very different. "First remove the plank from your own eye." And then he continued, "And then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye." That sentence changes everything, because it reveals that Jesus was not forbidding all correction. He was not eliminating moral responsibility. He was not saying that people should ignore harmful behavior in one another. What he was teaching was the proper order of the heart. First humility, then clarity. First self-examination, then guidance. In other words, the problem was never the desire to help someone else improve. The problem was attempting to do that while ignoring one's own deeper issues. This teaching was especially important in the religious environment of Jesus' time. Many religious leaders believed their role was to enforce righteousness by pointing out the failures of others. They scrutinized the behavior of ordinary people with incredible detail. They enforced strict rules about rituals, traditions, and public conduct. But Jesus repeatedly revealed something troubling about their approach. They were extremely focused on external appearances, yet they often neglected the inner transformation that God truly desired. In one famous moment, Jesus said to them, "You clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence." The problem was not that they cared about morality. The problem was that they cared more about appearances than authenticity. They were eager to judge others, but reluctant to examine themselves. And this pattern is not unique to ancient history. Human nature has not changed very much over the centuries. Even today, it is often easier to notice the faults of others than to confront the struggles within our own hearts. We can quickly recognize impatience in someone else, but we overlook the resentment we carry inside. We can easily criticize dishonesty in another person, but we ignore the small compromises we justify in our own lives. Jesus understood this tendency, and that is why his teaching focused so strongly on self-awareness. The plank in the eye represents those hidden areas of pride, insecurity, and hypocrisy that distort our ability to see clearly. When those things remain unexamined, any attempt to correct others becomes dangerous, because the correction may be motivated by ego rather than love. It may seek control rather than healing. But when someone honestly confronts their own weaknesses first, something remarkable happens. Their perspective changes. Humility replaces pride. Compassion replaces harshness. And the desire to help others becomes genuine rather than performative. This is why Jesus emphasized removing the plank first. Not because correction is forbidden, but because true correction requires clarity. And clarity grows out of humility. Without humility, judgment becomes destructive. With humility, discernment becomes helpful. This distinction lies at the very heart of what Jesus was teaching. He was not creating a world where no one could ever speak truth. He was creating a community where truth would be spoken with grace, where correction would come from a place of shared struggle rather than moral superiority, where people would approach one another as fellow travelers on a difficult journey, not as prosecutors searching for faults. In that kind of environment, accountability becomes constructive instead of condemning. It becomes an act of love rather than an act of power. And this is precisely the balance Jesus demonstrated throughout his life. When he encountered people burdened by shame, he offered mercy. When he encountered people trapped in destructive patterns, he offered truth. Sometimes those truths were gentle. Other times they were strong. But they were always directed toward restoration, never humiliation. Consider the story of the woman caught in adultery. Religious leaders brought her before Jesus, ready to condemn her publicly. They demanded judgment. They wanted a verdict. But Jesus responded with a simple statement. "Let the one who is without sin cast the first stone." One by one, the accusers walked away. Why? Because in that moment they were forced to confront their own imperfections. The plank in their own eyes suddenly became visible. Only after the crowd had left did Jesus speak to the woman, and his words held both compassion and truth. "Neither do I condemn you." And then he added something equally important. "Go and sin no more." Mercy and accountability, grace and truth, both present at the same time. That moment perfectly illustrates the balance Jesus was teaching. He refused to participate in hypocritical condemnation, but he also refused to pretend that harmful actions did not matter. He addressed both the heart and the behavior. And in doing so, he revealed the true meaning of his command. "Do not judge" was never meant to eliminate moral clarity. It was meant to transform the spirit in which moral clarity is expressed. The difference between condemnation and restoration, between pride and humility, between hypocrisy and genuine care. And once that context becomes clear, the famous command begins to look very different from the way it is often used today. Instead of silencing truth, it prepares the heart to speak truth wisely. Instead of removing accountability, it removes arrogance. But to fully understand this balance, one more distinction must become clear. Because not all evaluation is the same. There is a profound difference between judgment that condemns and discernment that guides. And understanding that difference unlocks the next layer of what Jesus was teaching. One of the greatest sources of confusion surrounding the command, "Do not judge," comes from a simple but powerful misunderstanding. Many people assume that all forms of evaluation are the same. They treat judgment and discernment as if they were identical. But they are not. In fact, they are profoundly different. Understanding this difference is essential if we want to grasp what Jesus was actually teaching. Because throughout his ministry, Jesus never discouraged discernment. He encouraged it. In several moments, he even commanded it. For example, Jesus once warned his followers about false prophets. These individuals, he explained, would not appear obviously dangerous. They would not arrive announcing their intentions. Instead, they would come disguised as trustworthy guides. They would speak convincingly. They would appear sincere. They would look harmless. Jesus described them with a powerful image. He said they would appear like sheep on the outside, but inwardly be like wolves. That warning raises an important question. If someone looks harmless on the outside, how would anyone recognize the danger? Jesus answered that question with a simple statement. You will know them by their fruits. In other words, observe their actions. Watch the patterns of their lives. Examine the results of what they teach. Do their words produce honesty, compassion, and integrity? Or do they produce manipulation, division, and selfish ambition? That process requires discernment. It requires careful observation. It requires the ability to distinguish between appearance and reality. Without discernment, people would have no protection against deception. Anyone could claim authority. Anyone could present themselves as a trustworthy guide. And communities would quickly become vulnerable to manipulation. Jesus clearly understood this danger. That is why he repeatedly encouraged his followers to remain alert. He did not want them to live in suspicion or hostility, but he did want them to live with wisdom. Discernment is the ability to recognize truth. It is the capacity to notice when something aligns with integrity and when it does not. It allows people to identify what leads to growth and what leads to harm. This type of evaluation is not motivated by pride. It is motivated by responsibility. Imagine a parent watching over a young child. The parent must constantly evaluate situations. Is this environment safe? Is this influence healthy? Is this behavior leading the child toward maturity or toward trouble? Those evaluations are not acts of condemnation. They are acts of protection. The same principle applies in communities, friendships, and spiritual life. Discernment protects people from harm. But judgment, in the destructive sense that Jesus warned about, works very differently. Judgment in this sense is not concerned with understanding. It is concerned with condemnation. It looks at another person and quickly assigns them a label. It reduces a complex human being to a single mistake. It does not seek restoration. It seeks superiority. This type of judgment is often driven by insecurity. When people feel uncertain about themselves, they may try to strengthen their identity by pointing out the flaws of others. By highlighting someone else's failure, they temporarily feel more righteous, more secure, more in control. But that feeling is an illusion, because condemnation never produces genuine growth. It creates shame. It creates defensiveness. It pushes people further away rather than drawing them closer to transformation. Jesus understood the destructive power of this kind of judgment. That is why he confronted it so directly. He saw how easily religious communities could fall into the trap of moral pride. He saw how quickly people could use truth as a weapon rather than a guide. But notice something important. When Jesus challenged hypocritical judgment, he did not remove the importance of truth. He did not say that harmful actions suddenly became harmless. He did not suggest that deception should be ignored. Instead, he shifted the focus. He shifted it away from condemnation and toward restoration. Discernment asks a question. What is true here? Judgment often asks a different question. Who is better? That difference may seem small at first, but its consequences are enormous. Discernment seeks clarity. Judgment seeks superiority. Discernment is careful. Judgment is quick. Discernment examines actions. Judgment attacks identity. One seeks understanding. The other seeks condemnation. When Jesus spoke about removing the plank from one's own eye, he was teaching people how to transform judgment into discernment. The process begins with humility. When someone honestly confronts their own weaknesses, they begin to understand how complicated the human heart can be. They recognize how easy it is to struggle. They remember the times when they themselves needed patience and grace. And that awareness changes the way they approach others. Instead of attacking, they listen. Instead of condemning, they seek to understand. Instead of humiliating, they aim to restore. Truth is still present, but it is delivered with compassion. And compassion makes it possible for truth to be received rather than rejected. This balance between truth and compassion was one of the most remarkable aspects of Jesus' ministry. People who were burdened by guilt felt safe approaching him. Yet those who clung to hypocrisy often felt deeply challenged by his words. Both reactions came from the same source: his commitment to truth. But truth spoken with the intention of healing rather than humiliating. This is the difference modern conversations often overlook. Many people today assume that love means avoiding difficult truths. They fear that speaking honestly will damage relationships, so they remain silent. But silence does not always protect relationships. Sometimes silence allows destructive patterns to continue unchecked. And over time, those patterns can cause far greater damage than a difficult conversation ever would. Discernment allows people to address problems before they become crises. It allows communities to protect their integrity. It allows individuals to grow through honest reflection. But discernment must always be guided by humility. Without humility, it easily slips back into judgment. This is why Jesus emphasized the importance of examining one's own heart first. Because the condition of the heart determines the impact of the words we speak. If correction comes from pride, it wounds. If correction comes from compassion, it heals. One tears down, the other builds up. The world often struggles to maintain this balance. Sometimes it swings toward harsh condemnation. Other times it swings toward moral silence. But the teaching of Jesus offers a different path. A path where truth and grace work together. A path where discernment protects people from harm, while humility protects them from arrogance. This path is not easy. It requires self-awareness. It requires patience. It requires courage. But when people begin to live this way, something remarkable happens. Communities become healthier. Relationships become more honest. Growth becomes possible. Because truth, when guided by humility, becomes one of the greatest expressions of love. And that is exactly what Jesus was trying to teach. But to fully understand why he emphasized humility so strongly, we must look at another important aspect of his message. Because there is a reason Jesus warned so seriously about hypocritical judgment. A reason rooted deeply in the human heart. An understanding that reason reveals why his command remains so powerful today. To understand why Jesus spoke so strongly about judgment, we have to look deeper into the human heart. Because hypocritical judgment is not just a mistake people occasionally make. It is a temptation that appears again and again throughout human history. In every culture. In every generation. And sometimes, most painfully, within religious communities themselves. The reason is simple. It is far easier to examine someone else's behavior than to examine our own. Looking inward requires honesty. It requires humility. It requires the courage to face uncomfortable truths about ourselves. But pointing out the faults of others can feel strangely satisfying. For a moment, it creates the illusion of moral superiority. When we focus on someone else's failures, we temporarily forget our own. This is one of the oldest patterns in human behavior. And Jesus recognized it immediately. That is why he confronted it so directly. Again and again, the strongest words Jesus spoke were not directed at those who openly struggled with sin. They were directed at those who believed they had no struggles at all. The religious leaders of his time often saw themselves as guardians of righteousness. They studied the law carefully. They observed religious rituals faithfully. They believed they were protecting the moral order of society. But somewhere along the way, something subtle began to change. Their concern for righteousness slowly transformed into something else. Pride. Instead of using truth to guide people toward healing, they used it to elevate themselves above others. Instead of recognizing their own need for grace, they focused on exposing the failures of everyone around them. Jesus described this behavior with startling clarity. In one moment he said, "You tie up heavy burdens and place them on people's shoulders, but you yourselves are not willing to lift a finger to help them." Those words reveal the true problem behind hypocritical judgment. It does not seek restoration. It seeks control. It creates rules, but offers no compassion. It exposes weakness, but offers no support. And when people encounter that kind of judgment, the result is almost always the same. They feel crushed rather than healed. They feel condemned rather than understood. They feel distant rather than restored. Jesus saw how destructive this approach was. He saw how easily religion could become a system of shame instead of a path toward transformation. And that is why his teaching consistently pointed people back toward humility. Humility is the antidote to hypocritical judgment. Because humility reminds us that every human being is still in the process of becoming. No one has reached perfection. No one has mastered every weakness. No one stands entirely free from the need for grace. When people remember this, their posture toward others changes. They still care about truth. They still recognize when something is harmful. But they approach those moments differently. They speak with compassion. They listen with patience. They remember that the person standing in front of them is not simply a collection of mistakes. They are a human being carrying their own story, their own struggles, and their own hopes. One of the most powerful illustrations of this appears in a story Jesus told about two men who went to the temple to pray. One of them was a religious leader known as a Pharisee. The other was a tax collector, someone widely despised in that society. The Pharisee stood confidently and prayed aloud. God, I thank you that I am not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. He then listed the religious practices he faithfully performed. Fasting, giving, observing the law. Everything about his prayer was focused on comparison. He measured his worth by pointing out how much better he believed himself to be than others. But the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even lift his eyes toward heaven. Instead, he simply said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Jesus then made a surprising statement. He said the second man, not the first, went home justified before God. Why? Because humility opens the door to transformation. Pride closes it. The Pharisee believed he had nothing left to learn, nothing left to change. But the tax collector recognized his need for grace. And that recognition created the possibility of real growth. This story reveals why hypocritical judgment is so dangerous. It blinds people to their own condition. When someone becomes convinced of their own righteousness, they stop examining themselves honestly. They become experts at identifying flaws in others while remaining unaware of the deeper issues within their own hearts. Jesus knew how easily this blindness could develop. That is why he warned so strongly against it. Because once pride takes root, it distorts the way we see everything. It turns compassion into criticism. It turns correction into condemnation. It turns faith into performance. And perhaps most tragically, it turns communities meant to offer healing into places that produce shame. This is the kind of judgment Jesus was confronting when he said, "Do not judge." He was not condemning discernment. He was confronting the arrogance that poisons it. He was challenging people to examine their motives before they examine someone else's actions. Because motives matter. Two people can speak the exact same words, but their intentions can produce completely different outcomes. Words spoken with pride wound. Words spoken with compassion restore. Correction delivered with arrogance humiliates. Correction delivered with humility guides. Jesus wanted his followers to become the kind of people who could offer truth without destroying dignity. People who could address wrongdoing while still affirming the value of the person standing before them. That balance is difficult. It requires constant self-reflection. It requires the willingness to ask uncomfortable questions about our own hearts. Why am I saying this? Is it truly meant to help? Or am I trying to prove something? Am I motivated by love? Or by the desire to appear superior? These questions are not easy, but they are necessary. Because without them, even good intentions can drift toward judgment. Jesus was not trying to create a world where no one ever speaks difficult truth. He was trying to create a community where truth is spoken with humility, where correction flows from compassion, where every person remembers that they too stand in need of grace. This awareness changes the entire atmosphere of accountability. Instead of condemnation, there is understanding. Instead of shame, there is encouragement. Instead of distance, there is restoration. And that transformation begins with a simple but profound shift. Before looking outward, we look inward. Before correcting others, we examine ourselves. Before speaking truth, we purify the motives of the heart. This is the path Jesus described. A path that replaces arrogance with humility. A path that transforms judgment into discernment. And when people begin to walk this path, something extraordinary begins to happen. Truth and compassion stop competing with each other. They begin working together. But that still leaves an important question. How should this teaching actually shape the way people live today? How do we apply the wisdom of Jesus in everyday conversations, relationships, and communities? Because understanding the principle is only the beginning. Living it requires courage. And that is where the next part of the story begins. Understanding the teaching of Jesus about judgment is one thing. Living it is something else entirely. Because the real challenge begins when these ideas move from theory into everyday life. What does it actually look like to follow this command in a world filled with disagreement, conflict, and moral confusion? How can someone speak truth without falling into pride? How can someone show compassion without ignoring harmful behavior? The answer begins with the posture of the heart. Jesus did not simply change what people say to one another. He changed the attitude behind those words. And that attitude begins with humility. Humility is the quiet awareness that none of us sees everything perfectly. Every person carries blind spots. Every person struggles with weaknesses. Every person is still growing. When someone remembers this, they approach conversations differently. They listen more carefully. They speak more gently. They recognize that correcting another person is not a moment to display superiority. It is a moment to show care. This kind of humility creates space for something powerful. Honest conversations that do not destroy relationships. But humility alone is not enough. Because avoiding pride does not mean avoiding truth. One of the greatest misunderstandings in modern culture is the belief that kindness requires silence. Many people feel that speaking uncomfortable truths automatically makes them unloving. So they avoid difficult conversations altogether. They tell themselves that staying quiet is the compassionate choice. But Jesus never taught people to hide from truth. In fact, truth was at the very center of his message. He spoke about it often. He described truth as something that sets people free. Freedom cannot exist without honesty. Imagine a doctor who refuses to tell a patient about a serious illness because the conversation might feel uncomfortable. That silence might seem gentle in the moment, but it would ultimately prevent healing. In the same way, avoiding difficult truths in relationships can prevent growth. Real love does not pretend that problems do not exist. Real love cares enough to address them. But the way truth is delivered matters just as much as the truth itself. Words spoken with arrogance can wound deeply. Words spoken with compassion can open the door to transformation. This is why the teaching of Jesus emphasizes both honesty and humility. Together, they create the foundation for healthy accountability. There are 3 simple principles that can help guide this process. The first is this: examine your own heart first. Before pointing out someone else's mistake, pause for a moment of self-reflection. Ask yourself an honest question. Is there something in my own life that needs attention? Am I approaching this conversation with humility? Or am I reacting out of frustration, pride, or impatience? This step is important because self-examination changes the tone of the conversation. Instead of speaking from a position of superiority, you speak from a place of shared humanity. You recognize that both people in the conversation are imperfect. Both are still learning. Both are still growing. That awareness softens the way truth is delivered. The second principle is this: speak truth with love. Truth and love were never meant to compete. They are meant to work together. Truth without love can feel harsh. Love without truth can feel empty. But when both are present, conversations become powerful tools for growth. Speaking truth with love means focusing on restoration rather than humiliation. It means choosing words that build rather than destroy. It means expressing concern for the person rather than attacking their character. Sometimes the difference between condemnation and guidance lies in something as simple as tone. A harsh accusation closes the door to listening, but a sincere expression of concern invites reflection. The goal is not to win an argument. The goal is to help someone see clearly. The third principle is this: correct without condemning. This may be the most difficult balance of all, because it requires distinguishing between a person and their behavior. Condemnation labels the entire person as a failure. Correction addresses the specific action that needs change. Jesus consistently separated these two things. He challenged harmful behavior while still recognizing the dignity of the person standing before him. When people experience correction in this way, they are far more likely to respond positively, because they feel respected rather than attacked. This approach transforms accountability into something constructive. Instead of feeling like a courtroom, the conversation becomes a place of guidance. These principles apply to every area of life. In friendships, in families, in communities, even within spiritual communities where people gather to grow in faith. Healthy communities do not avoid accountability, but they practice it with humility. Members encourage one another. They celebrate growth. They also gently challenge patterns that lead toward harm, but always with the understanding that everyone involved is still learning, still growing, still in need of grace. This mindset changes the atmosphere of relationships. People feel safe being honest about their struggles. They know they will not be crushed by condemnation, but they also know they will not be ignored if something harmful begins to appear. Truth and compassion work together, and when that happens, growth becomes possible, because growth requires both. A community that only offers truth may become harsh. A community that only offers comfort may become stagnant. But when both truth and compassion exist together, transformation can occur. This is the environment Jesus envisioned. A community where people help one another see clearly, where humility replaces arrogance, where correction becomes an act of care rather than control. But this way of living requires courage, because speaking truth with humility is not always easy. Sometimes people will misunderstand. Sometimes they may respond defensively. Sometimes the conversation will be uncomfortable. Yet avoiding truth altogether rarely produces better results. In the long run, honesty guided by compassion builds stronger relationships. It creates deeper trust. It allows people to grow beyond patterns that might otherwise hold them back. This is the wisdom hidden within the command, "Do not judge." It is not an invitation to moral silence. It is an invitation to moral maturity, a call to examine ourselves honestly, a call to care about others deeply, and a call to speak truth in a way that reflects both humility and love. When these qualities come together, something remarkable happens. Judgment disappears, but wisdom remains. And that wisdom becomes a powerful force for healing in a world that desperately needs it. Which brings us to the final and most important insight of this teaching. Because once we understand the heart behind the command of Jesus, it changes the way we see both ourselves and others. And it reveals the deeper purpose behind one of the most misunderstood statements ever spoken. When people hear the words, "do not judge," they often imagine a world where no one is allowed to speak about right or wrong. A world where every action must be accepted. A world where truth becomes silent in order to preserve comfort. But that was never the world Jesus was describing. His words were not an invitation to moral confusion. They were an invitation to moral clarity. Clarity that begins inside the human heart. The real danger Jesus was confronting was not discernment. It was hypocrisy. The kind of hypocrisy that magnifies the smallest faults of others while ignoring the deeper struggles within ourselves. The kind of hypocrisy that uses truth as a weapon instead of a path toward healing. The kind of hypocrisy that turns faith into a performance rather than a transformation. This is why Jesus spoke so vividly about the plank and the speck. Because that image forces us to pause and look inward before looking outward. It reminds us that the first place truth must work is within our own lives. Before we try to correct the world around us. Before we try to guide someone else. Before we speak difficult words. We must ask a quiet but powerful question. What is happening inside my own heart? Am I approaching this moment with humility? Or am I trying to elevate myself by pointing out someone else's failure? Am I speaking out of love? Or am I reacting out of pride? These questions are not easy, but they are essential, because without them, even the right words can produce the wrong outcome. Truth delivered without humility often wounds, but truth delivered with humility can heal. And healing is what Jesus cared about most. Throughout his life, he showed an extraordinary balance between compassion and honesty. He welcomed people who felt rejected by society. He offered forgiveness to those burdened by guilt. He spoke gently to those who were broken. Yet at the same time, he did not ignore harmful behavior. He did not pretend that truth did not matter. He challenged hypocrisy. He exposed deception. He called people to transformation. Grace and truth moved together in everything he did. Neither one replaced the other. Instead, they worked together to bring restoration. This balance remains one of the most beautiful aspects of his teaching, because it reveals that genuine love does not avoid truth, and genuine truth does not destroy love. The two are meant to exist side by side. In our modern world, it is common to see these two things separated. Sometimes truth is emphasized without compassion. Sometimes compassion is emphasized without truth. Both extremes create problems. Truth without compassion becomes harsh and condemning. Compassion without truth becomes shallow and powerless. But the wisdom of Jesus offers another path. A path where humility prepares the heart to speak honestly. A path where discernment protects people from harm without turning them into enemies. A path where accountability becomes an act of care rather than an act of control. This path requires courage. It requires self-awareness. And perhaps most importantly, it requires remembering that every person we encounter is still in the process of becoming. Every person carries unseen struggles. Every person is learning. Every person is imperfect, including ourselves. When we remember this, our posture changes. Instead of approaching others as judges, we approach them as fellow travelers. People walking the same difficult road. People who sometimes stumble. People who sometimes need guidance. People who sometimes need grace. And when correction becomes necessary, we offer it not from a place of superiority, but from a place of shared humanity. That is the heart behind the command of Jesus. Do not judge was never meant to silence truth. It was meant to purify the heart of the one speaking it. It was meant to remove pride so that discernment could become compassionate. It was meant to replace condemnation with restoration. Because the goal was never simply to point out what is wrong. The goal was always to lead people toward what is right, toward healing, toward growth, toward transformation. This is why the teaching of Jesus still speaks so powerfully today. In a world where arguments are loud and compassion is often scarce. In a world where people quickly label one another and rarely listen. In a world where pride and defensiveness easily replace humility, his words invite us to something better. They invite us to examine our own hearts, to speak truth carefully, to love people deeply, and to remember that wisdom begins not with judging others, but with seeing ourselves clearly. Because once the plank is removed from our own eyes, we may finally be able to help others see the path forward as well.